Hi, and welcome to this first lesson, the pelvis, explore, free, and release. In this lesson, we will learn why it is fundamental to understand how our pelvis and hips work, what is pelvis rotation, and why we want to specifically work on that rotation. Then, we will look at the different muscles involved in this rotation. This lesson is useful for you no matter your type of scoliosis. In fact, working on the pelvis is fundamental for most people. So why is the pelvis so important, and why do we want to start here? The starting point is that the different structures of the body are not separated. They are integrated, they complement each other and influence each other. And the pelvis, which is located in the middle of the body, connects the lower and the upper body, so it is really important to understand how it works. The pelvis is formed by four bones, the right and the left hip bones, the sacrum and the coccyx. The main function of the pelvis is to support the weight of the upper body and transfer this weight to the lower limbs when standing, so it is directly related to the spine and the legs. It has a major function in allowing us to stand upright and walk, and a dysfunctional pelvis will affect the behavior and the function of our spine and lower limbs. But it also goes the other way around. The function of our spine and limbs can also affect the way the pelvis function. The pelvis moves in different ways. It tilts forward, we call it anterior pelvic tilt, and backwards, which is called posterior pelvic tilt. It also tilts sideways to the left and right, and it rotates to the right and to the left. These movements happen in the whole pelvis in one block, but they are also movements in between the bones. The muscles around the pelvis are holding the hip joint together. So tightness around the muscles holding the hip joint together or dysfunction in how they activate will most probably have consequences for how the pelvis is positioned and vice versa. If the pelvis is imbalanced in its position or function, then it will have consequences for how the hip joint will function, how you perform all of the movements that the hip is supposed to do. So here are the movements of the hips, flexion and extension, which you do every time you take a step forward, walk up the stairs, sit down or stand up from your chair. Abduction and adduction, which is opening the leg to the side and bringing it back to center. And external rotation and internal rotation. In this section, and with scoliosis, we are particularly interested in the rotation of the pelvis, where the two hip bones rotate independently from each other, not in one block, but each separately. For example, the right hip bone moves forward while the left hip bone moves backward. This sounds like a bit dramatic, but it is actually very common. More than 80% of people have some kind of rotation in the pelvis, and the wide majority of the cases, the pelvis rotates to the left. It means that the right hip bone rotates forward and the left hip bone rotates backward. So if you look at the whole pelvis together, it all moves towards the left. This asymmetry, rotation, comes from an imbalance in the muscles of the pelvis and of the legs, that is due to the use we make of them, for example, which is completely normal. Nobody is completely symmetrical. And this asymmetry tends to increase with age, which is logical, because the more we repeat the movements and continue to move a certain way, the more the body, the structure of the body, adjusts to these movement patterns. In the case of scoliosis, you can imagine how it can affect the position and the function of the spine. The complex thing is that for a similar rotation of the pelvis to the left, there are many different scoliosis patterns. It's very complex, but what is quite clear is that our bodies are amazing at compensating, and that there are many other factors that cause the spine to curve. The position of the pelvis is only one of them. But to simplify a bit, you can imagine that if a body part isn't allowed to do a movement that it is supposed to do, then another body part will have to do the job. In the case of rotation, if the pelvis rotates one way, then some other body part above or below will have to rotate the other way to compensate. We can take as an example the most common type of scoliosis, the one with a lumbar curve convex to the left and thoracic curve convex to the right. A shift in the position of the pelvis means that the sacrum also changes position and that the last lumbar vertebra will also have to adapt, and it will also move to the left in the same direction that the pelvis rotates. The sacrum will drag the last lumbar vertebra, which will in turn drag the next vertebra, and so on. And so you will have both a curve to the left in the lumbar spine and a rotation of the vertebra. To compensate, the body will create a second curve with rotation in the opposite direction to try to find some balance between the head and the sacrum. It also has an effect on the lower limbs. A rotated pelvis can give the impression that one leg is shorter than the other.